Let's go back now and look at a more detailed chronological view of the various pieces of evidence not previously mentioned, or some additional material to what I've already mentioned that point to a reweave. As I mentioned in the introduction, there will be an overlapping of timelines, so we're going to go back even pre-STURP for some background. Enzo de Lorenzi, a member of the Turin Commission that studied the Shroud in 1969 and 1973, wrote, "I should like to mention the impression I received during the course of my examination, namely, that more pairs of hands have carried out the darning than is suggested in the historical records." The slide I have on the screen is from a presentation of the archaeologist Marie Grazia Ciliazzo, who I will mention more about a little later. Textile expert Gilbert Reyes, who has previously mentioned, extracted a sample in 1973 for analysis, wrote in his report that he had found cotton. He also noted, quote, "The thread used for sewing the two pieces, designated piece 1 and piece 2, together is twisted in an S direction, whereas the individual threads are twisted in a Z direction." Later research by Rogers revealed each piece exhibited different characteristics, such as cotton content, lignin content at the growth nodes, and thread size, suggesting two different origins of the yarns. The continuous, fully observable sewing thread represents a significant change of technique and suggests this section of thread, which incorporated the rhea sample and the C14 sample areas, was applied from the top instead of the reverse of the cloth. This further implies that two sections of sewing threads, C14 region versus main cloth, were applied at different times and by different artisans. According to Fleury-Lemberg, the shroud stitching is possibly from the same time period as a cloth from Masada in Israel, dated 40 BC to AD 74. Archaeologist Paul Maloney related the following in a 2008 conference presentation. In March of 1981, the late Walter Macron sent me several Kodak transparencies of shots he took looking at linen fibers on the shroud. On those slides, still preserved in my collection, Macron had written the following note: madder rose, linen fiber, medium, blue sample 3CB, and sample 3AB. Macron was referring to photomicrographs made on STURP sticky tape samples 3CB and 3AB, which came from the blood flow across the back nearest the side strip of the shroud and directly adjacent to that flow on linen itself. It was on that side where someone would have been working their repairs if the reweave theory is held to be correct. Macron, of course, due to his belief that the shroud was painted by an artist, was trying to prove that the shroud had been in an artist's studio. Hence, he sent me these photomicrographs as a piece of that evidence. And I don't actually have pictures of those photomicrographs. That's just in the quote. We will return to this matter later on, no pun intended. According to the late C14 scientist Harry Gove, the overseer of the C14 testing Michael Tite, discussing the 1986 planning meeting in Turin, which was eventually discarded the day of the this is a quote, Type felt there should be a textile expert present if samples were to be taken to make sure that we were getting a piece of cloth from the main body of the shroud on which the image was imprinted and not a rewoven area or a patch. Italian researchers, the late Orazio Petrosillo and Emanuele Marinelli, recount the discussion that took place between so-called textile experts before the sample was taken in 1988, including the late Frenchman Gabriel Vial. They wrote, Vial had no particular advice to give, limiting himself to suggesting that the pieces should be taken from the side in order not to damage the image. According to rumors that were current in France, Vial tried in vain to warn those present that the selected area could well have been a patch and not a part of the original shroud. The late Giovanni Rigi di Numana, who actually cut the C-14 sample used in the testing, remarked, quote, I was authorized to cut approximately 8 square centimeters of cloth from the shroud, from the same place that was provided for Professor Ray's. This was then reduced to about 7 centimeters because fibers of other origins had become mixed up with the original fabric and could have led to erroneous readings in the dating experiment. The question is, were there perhaps more foreign fibers that existed? Remember, only a visual inspection and a simplistic optical device were used. Rigi, he goes, sometimes you'll hear his name as Rigi, and sometimes Rigi di Numana. While discussing how, for public exhibitions, a pole was inserted in the side from which the C-14 sample was taken, wrote, quote, this wear and tear made major repairs necessary, which can still be seen today in upper corners, both left and right. Repairs which required the addition of new fabric by skilled seamstresses to reinforce the shreds of material from the original. And while discussing the stitching that joined the shroud to its backing cloth, he commented, but what is certain is that the color of the thread used for this stitching blends in perfectly with the threads of the shroud itself, and being no thicker than warp or weft, it cannot be detected with the naked eye. It would have been interesting to know more about these, whether, for example, they were unraveled from the shroud itself or from the fragments cut off from the edges during repairs and adjustments, or how, in the case of a different origin, a thread was found that blended so well with the fibers of the shroud, changing color as a result of the aging process in such a way as to be completely invisible. Note that Rigi mentions the matching of the stitching thread to the color of the shroud and becoming invisible. When Oxford University looked at their sample, the late Edward Hall noticed fibers that looked out of place. A laboratory in Derbyshire determined that the rogue fibers were cotton of, quote, a fine, dark yellow strand. And according to Peter South of the lab, it may have been used for repairs at some time in the past. This sample should have raised red flags, since the shroud is linen. Professor Reyes, who had been given permission to extract a shroud sample in 1973, stated at the 1989 Paris Symposium that he believed that in the 1988 Oxford sample he examined, the cotton he observed was contained inside the threads, which actually could help to explain the difference in fiber diameter. Meacham, in a press release after the announcement of the C-14 dating results, noted that due to the fire of 1532, the sample area might have contained fibers woven in by a restorer in the Middle Ages. He quoted Dr. Stuart Fleming, formerly of Oxford Laboratory for Archaeology and also the University of Pennsylvania, as saying that this putative restorer, quote, could certainly have rewoven a damaged edge to a standard not visible to the naked eye. During the videotaped question and answer session at that Paris conference, which was only about a year after the 88 dating, the late C-14 scientist Jacques Avan, who had participated in the dating, was specifically asked about the possibility of a reweave, and he said, "I quite agree that the labs did not take the weaving techniques into account, and they did not date the threads per se. Thus, if the weave was rewoven with threads from modern restoration, this would be reflected in more modern results." So he is clearly admitting that the C-14 sample area may have contained threads that were added subsequent to the date assigned to the shroud. 5 years before the shroud was carbon dated, Avan had said in an article about C-14 in a journal, "It is evident that samples to be dated should contain carbon. However, the mere presence of this chemical element is not sufficient to produce a valid result. After many years of C-14 dating, it has been shown that numerous results are in error or are erroneously interpreted, often because of lack of knowledge about the value of the material selected for dating. The shroud was not your optimum, buried for a long time archaeological object, but had been subjected to much handling and exposure to many environmental hazards, had undergone various repairs, and there are certainly many questions about the suitability of the sample that was ultimately chosen. Belgian chemist Remy van Helst noted that to pass the chi-square test, which determines comparability of two or more disparate samples, statisticians tell us that the calculated value should be lower than 6. The chi-square test value for the shroud is 6.4, meaning that the subsamples cannot be considered identical, or rather, from the same representative sample. The late STURP blood chemist Al Adler stated in an interview published in 1996, "So you can talk all you want about how reproducible the date is, but you can't talk about how accurate it is. You have no way of knowing if the area you took the C-14 sample from represents the whole cloth. That's an area which has obviously been repaired. There's cloth missing there. It's been rewoven on the edge. They even cut part of it off because it was obviously rewoven on the edge. The simplest explanation why the date may be off is that it's rewoven cloth there, and that's not been tested." But Adler was apparently not aware of some significant historical research regarding this. In 1993, the archaeologist Maria Grazia Ciliazzo made a presentation at the Rome conference. She stated, "The Shroud of Turin carries with it a centuries-old dramatic history. It was manipulated many times for mending and restoration works." She also wrote, "The quantity and variety of mending stitches observed on the shroud from the Middle Ages to date, from Edessa to Constantinople, Léré, Chambéry, and Turin, is impressive. Tacking, hemming, whipping, stringing, and mending stitches, and many others. Add to this an amount of parts, invisible to the naked eye, which were reinforced and may be remade with the invisible mending technique. The shroud's Mediterranean cloth, because of its very ancient handcrafted structure, the significant caliber, and the thick weaving, perfectly absorbs an intervention of this kind. Notice that she uses the term invisible mending. Ciliazzo also made a minute analysis of data pertaining to the weight of medium weight per square centimeter of the Shroud's cloth compared to weights of the C14 samples. I won't go into details here. Her original paper is available on Barry's site, but she concluded, as a result, what emerges is the proof that the sample was irregularly loaded with foreign, undetermined textile material. In other words, many threads were added for its mending with various techniques in different, much later ages. If in fact there are cotton fibers in the C14 area, one would expect to find evidence of chemical differences. Dr. Adler, in a 1996 paper, showed a graph, which I'm not going to show you here, that illustrates the absorbance patterns of image, non-image, radiocarbon warp, water stain, scorch, and serum single fiber samples, and made the following statements. The patterns are all distinguishably different from one another, clearly indicating differences in their chemical composition. In particular, the radiocarbon samples are not representative of the non-image samples that comprise the bulk of the cloth. Also in 1996, Petrosillo and Marinelli wrote in their book, the section from which the specimens were cut is part of the border of the shroud that has, over the centuries, been repeatedly handled. It is plausible to think that wear and tear could have damaged it to a point that a restoration became necessary. It is not excluded that the corner could have been repaired in a way that is invisible to the naked eye, something which the expert restorers of the medieval times knew how to do extremely well. Flax, cotton, or threads of a type not distinguishable from the original ones of the shroud could have been used. It should also be noted that the two authors said that the samples, the C14 samples, had weighed twice as much as expected. A blend of linen and cotton threads could explain the higher weight. Petrosillo and Marinelli also mention a controversial supposed secret C14 test of the shroud in 1982, which was done on one of the 1973 Reyes samples. They noted, during the pre-treatment, the presence of starch was noted that could have been used for the dressing of the cloth by a medieval restorer. It was commonly used for invisible mending. In 2000, the late Alan Adler and two co-authors wrote, unfortunately, a detailed protocol for sampling the cloth to assure both precision and accuracy recommended by a convened meeting of consultants was not followed. Only a single sample was taken from a rewoven edge in a water-stained area only a few inches from one of the burn marks incurred in the historically recorded 1532 fire. This location was near the bottom of the frontal body image on the edge where a large section of cloth is missing below the seamed so-called side strip. No historic record exists accounting for this missing material and how or when this damage occurred. The nature and or extent of the repairs undertaken here are also unknown. Therefore, the possibility exists that this selvage edge might be linen not original to the shroud. The selection of this single suspicious sample site is a sufficient reason to doubt the accuracy of the radio date. This spectroscopic investigation was therefore undertaken to determine whether any evidence can be obtained to support such doubts. The peak patterns and relative intensity patterns in other regions of the spectra are also consistent with the conclusion that the spectral patterns of these fibers are all distinguishably different from one another. Note that this is specifically true for the radiocarbon fibers and the non-image fibers from the bulk of the cloth, thereby demonstrating that the area selected for the radiocarbon sampling is atypical and is clearly not representative of the rest of the cloth. In 2002, in an article by Rogers and a co-author, it states, there were no amorphous materials cementing fibers together except for the blood, serum, and some starch and gum on threads from the rhea sample. So Roger mentions starch in the context of also finding gum, which point to a repair. In 1978, STURP had taken some pictures now known as the quad mosaics, which included the area from which the C14 sample had been taken. They surfaced again in 2003 in light of all the research that was going on regarding that corner of the cloth. STURP member imaging specialist, the late Jean Lohr, was asked about these photos, on which Lohr said that different colors represent different chemical compositions. And Barry wrote, notice that the area adjoining the patch where the C14 sample was taken from and ostensibly part of the actual shroud is also mostly the same color of green. This is further convincing supportive scientific evidence that this area is inherently different in composition than the rest of the shroud. End quote. Archaeologist Paul Maloney noted in that 2008 presentation that he wished he had been aware of the quad mosaic back in 1987 when he gave scientific advisor Luigi Ganella advice regarding where the sample should be taken. Maloney felt that the pictures could have helped convince Ganella not to take the sample from that location. It has been pointed out that all four corners of the shroud are green, but it's certainly possible that if the shroud corner had been manipulated, the other three corners could have been reinforced at the same time. But the important point is that the color in the C14 corner is significantly different than the main part of the shroud. A comprehensive article on the history of radiocarbon dating by a member of the prestigious National Institute of Standards and Technology in Maryland was published in spring 2004. The author had a section on the shroud and stated regarding the controversy regarding the sample taking, the sampling location near a corner of the shroud and near an area damaged by the fire of 1532 is considered an unfortunate choice because of the possibility of exogenous carbon from the fire, repairs, and organic contamination from handling through the ages. Ray Rogers at first thought the repair hypothesis was nonsense until he started working on the fibers located to the next to the C14 samples, and later on an actual leftover sample from the 88 dating, and comparing them to fibers he still had from the main part of the cloth from 1978. And in his Thermochemica Acta article from 2005, he wrote, the presence of alizarin dye and red lakes in the rheas and radiocarbon samples indicates that the color has been manipulated. Specifically, the color and distribution of the coating implies that repairs were made at an unknown time with foreign linen dyed to match the older original material. The radiocarbon sampling area is uniquely coated with a yellow-brown plant gum containing dye lakes. Pyrolysis mass spectrometry results from the sample area, coupled with microscopic and microchemical observations, prove that the radiocarbon sample was not part of the original cloth of the Shroud of Turin. The radiocarbon date was thus not valid for determining the true age of the shroud. Rogers found an incrustation of plant gum on the outside of the C14 sample fibers. Chemical and microscopic analysis showed embedded madder root dye particles. Rogers also enlisted the help of the late microscopist John Brown, who did his own analysis on Rogers' fibers from the threa sample. Brown believed that after the area had been rewoven, dye was applied in an attempt to match the color of the shroud. Brown removed warp threads from weft threads, revealing undyed areas. According to Brown, undyed areas do not fluoresce like dyed areas, as shown in this UV photomicrograph. In both the rheas and C14 samples, cotton fibers were found interwoven with the linen. Apart from some surface cotton fibers from STURP members' gloves, no cotton was found anywhere else on the shroud. Gum and dye particle incrustations were found on the outer surface of many fibers. Here's another photo of gum and dye particle incrustations. And one last photomicrograph of them. In a 2005 paper by the late Dr. Alan Whanger and his wife Mary, they concluded, on studying the radiographs of the shroud made in 1978, details of the seams and threads can be seen. It appears that the side seam was put in as a tuck, and that near the two missing corners, there are variations in weave patterns and in thread densities, which suggests that these two areas had been damaged and then repaired in some way. Examination of the site of the C14 single sample indicates that at least part of the sample was taken from one of these repaired or altered areas. And the tuck they refer to as a fold or pleat in fabric that is sewn in place. Michael Erlich, owner of Without a Trace in Chicago, began invisible mending services in Chicago around the mid-1990s, and he said, "Today there is a modern time-saving technique called inweaving that would be invisible from the surface but easily recognizable from the back. However, the technique used in 16th century Europe called French weaving is an entirely different matter. French weaving involves a tedious thread-by-thread restoration that is indeed invisible. 16th century owners of the shroud certainly had enough material, resources, and weeks of time at their disposal to accomplish the task." Ray Rogers also sent some rheas sample fibers to Los Alamos chemist Bob Villarreal, who confirmed Rogers' findings of a splice. Villarreal wrote, "The many strands of fibers from the 3 threads analyzed gave FTIR, Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy, signature of cotton and definitely did not give evidence of linen." Villarreal agreed with Rogers that the samples were not representative of the main shroud. Villarreal also enlisted the help of other scientists at Los Alamos who concluded that there had been repairs in that area. Okay, I'm going to show these various tests, and I'm not going to read these slides. For one thing, my voice is wearing out. And the second thing is most of the words are too hard for me to pronounce. give you a second to look at all. And of course, you'll be able to look more closely once the proceedings come out. And Dr. John Schoonover stated the group's conclusion: thread is suspected to be from region of shroud repair. French physician Thibault Heimberger, who was given access to several of the raised threads that Rogers had studied, emailed Sue, Barry, and myself after examining Reyes thread number 7 and a polarizing light microscope, and he wrote, "I can now confirm with absolute certainty that there are cotton fibers in the thread on the internal layer. I can say that I clearly see bundles of 5 to 10 cotton fibers, at least in 2 directions, and some individual cotton fibers. I would say finally that Reyes number 7 does contain about 10% of cotton, perhaps more in the external layer. But most importantly, it is absolutely sure that most of the cotton fibers are gathered together in bundles mixed with linen fibers inside the whole thread. Ray Rogers was absolutely right, but now we can describe more clearly the structure of Reyes 7, and I can show not only individual fibers, but also the group of fibers. Reyes 7 is definitely a thread intentionally spun with linen and cotton." He also wrote a 3-part article on analyses of the Reyes samples that Rogers had, and says about the Villarreal microphotograph that I showed you a few slides ago. "This discovery is obviously of paramount interest for the following reasons. First, the splice is not at all obvious if we look at the photograph. Reyes did not see it. Rogers, who was not a textile expert, did, looking carefully at the sample with his microscope. Second, the brown resin-like crust described as a micro-sized circular cocoon-shaped brown crust could not be seen under the microscope. This is very surprising. Third, this shows that this part of the shroud has been managed thread by thread, contrary to the main part of the shroud. And the main part of the shroud is a 3-to-1 herringbone weave." Author Mark Oxley, who unfortunately was supposed to attend our conference and couldn't, points out in his 2011 article that whereas Dr. Joel of the Arizona lab measured the thickness of the radiocarbon samples at 250 microns, Italian writer Gian Rinaldi stated that the measurements of samples from the main part of the shroud are 390 microns, suggesting a different composition between main shroud fibers and C14 fibers. And remember that Professor Reyes had noticed a difference in fiber diameter. Paul Maloney, from that 2008 presentation, presented a list of those who had found cotton inside of the fibers in the Reyes corner. Reyes himself, 73-74. STURP's 1981 early analysis is reported by their spokesperson, Joan Janney. Investigators at Precision Processes in England. Ray Rogers' investigations. John Brown's investigations. And Robert Villarreal and team investigations. Maloney laid out all the various components based on Rogers' research that seemed to indicate a repair. 1, linen cotton spun yarns spliced into the shroud cloth and showing a coating of starch, aluminum mordant and other metallic salts, gum arabic binder, and madder rose dye. Let's now return to the madder rose that Macron had written Maloney about in 1981. You'll recall that Macron had found madder rose on the samples and believed that showed that an artist was involved. But Maloney concluded, there is now a new way of looking at the presence of that madder rose. Although this is some distance from the Reyes corner, such trace amounts can now be conjectured to explain the dye that was used, along with the aluminum mordant and the gum arabic as a binder to create the wash to finish the reweave. Thus, it may now be seen not as a contaminant from an artist's studio, but rather a contaminant from the weaver's workshop. In 2010, an article co-authored by Timothy Joel of the Arizona lab recounted what was found in a leftover sample that their lab had retained, although the Nature paper had given the impression that Arizona had dated all of their samples. Joel admitted cotton fibers were found, which matched what Oxford had found in their aforementioned sample before it was dated. Despite this, Joel concluded that their sample had come from the main part of the shroud, which cannot be considered a great surprise. In 2012, John Morgan of the Geospatial Research and Education Laboratory at Towson University wrote a highly technical paper detailing the analysis of an ultraviolet shroud photo, and the author concluded that there is evidence of cotton in the C14 sampling area. Barry recently sent to the private internet Shroud Science Group a communication that included a picture of a transmitted light image of the C14 corner. And he said, when I examined the C14 sample site at higher magnification in Photoshop, there seemed to be a darker area to the right of the seam that could be interpreted as a positive indication of manipulation. Barry also showed a white light image of the area and wrote, most notable is the very obvious darker coloration of the C14 sample site area adjacent to the seam, which fades gradually into the lighter color of the rest of the shroud. This is not a shadow. The shroud was definitely a different, meaning darker, shade in this area. In 2014, an English translation of a book by the Savoy family archivist Carlos Evaristo was published. The Savoy family had owned the shroud prior to 1985. While discussing the seam that runs down the side of the shroud and along the area from which the samples were taken, he writes, the section could have been ordered or rewoven back onto the original hole, or else the section in question was substituted with another piece of similar cloth. Most researchers believe that the side strip is an original part of the shroud. And he added, another fact confirmed by His Majesty was that it was traditionally affirmed that at one point in the past, the edges of the sheet had become so tattered as to cause embarrassment or criticism of the custodians, and those areas were repaired and rewoven using identical techniques, but obviously with similar yet newer materials containing dyes and other medieval manufacturing ingredients in an attempt to better blend the new sections in as best possible with the original fabric. So Evaristo is asserting that King Umberto, who owned the shroud, had stated that the C14 sample area had repair fibers added to it. Pam Moon, who's here with us today, authored an important paper in 2015 and said, the name of the article is "The Presence of Dye in the 1988 Radiocarbon Date Samples of the Shroud of Turin." And it contains many superb photos from the sample taking on April 21st of '88, and also the subsamples, and also photomicrographs of the rare samples and diagrams. Now, if you go online and find that article, be patient because there's so many photos there, it takes a long time to load. It also explains via Brazilian-born English textile expert Teresina Roberts how the dyeing process on fabrics is done. Textile expert Donna Campbell of Thomas Ferguson Limited in the UK, which was one of the three entities that had told Sue and me in 2000 that they had found indications of a repair, examined some photos of the sample used by Oxford for their Shroud C14 dating, thanks to Pam. She observed, yarns break during weaving. The success in identifying these breaks and fixing depends on the skill of the hand weaver. However, there are signs in the Shroud sample that direct the notion of mending or reweaving of the actual woven fabric. It should be noted that the 1978 STURP study was multidisciplinary. The C14 test in 1988 was also supposed to have been done in a multidisciplinary context, but various machinations among various participants prevented that from happening. And if you're interested in all those Machiavellian events, I have a 3-part, 75-page article that you can find on Barry's site called "The Politics of the Radiocarbon Dating of the Turin Shroud." If you take the time to read that, you will be shaking your head a lot. In late 2015, an article about the DNA found on the Shroud stated, "A medieval age does not appear to be compatible with the production technology of the linen, nor with the chemistry of fibers obtained directly from the main part of the cloth in 1978. A statement not exclusive to the reweave theory, but certainly consistent with it. Beta Analytic, one of the most prestigious C14 labs in the world, makes some notable comments on its website regarding requirements for samples for C14 dating. It says, "The lab does not undertake the dating of textiles or other valuable or priceless items unless they are submitted and paid for by a recognized governmental agency, major museum, or other official agency that is investigating the materials as part of a multidisciplinary scholarly process. You may submit your sample through a professional archaeologist who will make an assessment if your sample is suitable for radiocarbon dating. Note that Beta Analytic requires that the dating be part of a multidisciplinary scholarly process and that an archaeologist should assess whether the sample is suitable or not. The 1988 Shroud C14 dating was not multidisciplinary, and although they did receive advice from an archaeologist in the original planning, that advice was ignored. Had Beta Analytic been one of the labs that had been asked to do the 1988 dating, it is very possible that it would have refused. And earlier this year, Tristan's paper was published in Archaeometry, and it says a statistical analysis of the Nature article and the raw data strongly suggests that homogeneity is lacking in the data and that the procedure should be reconsidered. It also mentions that the Oxford lab and the Arizona lab had found cotton in their samples. A meeting was held in Catania, Italy on May 23, 2019 to discuss the findings from that paper. And both the Vatican and the Turin authorities reported on it. One was called Notes, or the article that mentioned both the Vatican and the Turin was called Notes on the Radiocarbon Age of the Turin Shroud. An official press release was put out which said the selected sample, chosen only from one point of the linen, very contaminated and mended, could not represent the entire cloth. Teresi and Pergnagallo, probably pronounced that wrong, underline the strong heterogeneity between the three laboratories and inside the laboratories as alarms of non-representativeness from a statistical point of view of the textile samples. After that paper was published, I talked extensively with Dr. Eric Jumper, co-founder of the STURP team. Jumper, like Rogers, initially believed the 1988 C14 results and stated publicly that it could not be the burial cloth of Jesus. However, after Rogers' 2005 paper and a long discussion with one of the Los Alamos team of 9 that had looked at Rogers' Reyes sample, Jumper now has doubts about his previous certainty, which he stated in 2013 in a public presentation he gave at Notre Dame University, where he teaches. Changing one's mind in the face of new evidence is the essence of good science. I will briefly just mention some of the other hypotheses put forth to challenge the 1988 dating. The first hypothesis, advocated by the late Jesuit priest Dr. Werner Bolst and French monk Brother Bruno Bonnet-Aymar, among others, is that the samples were fraudulently switched. One of the best-known Shroud researchers, historian Ian Wilson, says of Brother Bruno's writings, to enumerate the errors, omissions, overstatements, fallacies, and outright fantasies would be wearisome beyond belief. Suffice it to say that it is a conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory, glossily packaged with impressive seeming graphics and undeniably excellent color photographs, but not with the slightest serious evidence to back it up. The second hypothesis, proposed by various individuals, was the heat effects from the 1532 fire made the C14 date invalid. One problem is that one of the major proponents, probably the first proponent of this hypothesis, Russian scientist Dr. Dmitry Kuznetsov, was later found to have falsified much research, not only with the Shroud but other areas. And no hard evidence has been found yet that this hypothesis excuse me, is viable. The third hypothesis, put forth by the late Marie Claire van Oostwijk-Gastusch, that's a mouthful, a Belgian chemist, was that water put on the Shroud after the 1532 fire makes the C14 dating suspect. I have not found any refutations of this in the Shroud literature, but neither have I found any positive support. A fourth hypothesis, offered by amateur archaeologist Dr. Leoncio Garza Valdez, is that a bioplastic coating known to be found on various archaeological objects caused the dating to be wrong. According to Adler, quote, "His work lacks hard, convincing, quantitative evidence on which to judge the merits of his claims." A fifth hypothesis by Australian blogger Stephen Jones is that the 1260 to 1390 date was a result of a computer hacking. Jones believes that a fully computerized AMS radiocarbon dating process was used despite the early days of computer networking and was vulnerable to manipulation by a computer hacker. To date, there is little support for this hypothesis. Both Timothy Joel of Arizona and Dr. Christopher Ramsey of Oxford say that this is impossible, inasmuch as the calculation didn't even require software, and the machines used at the time weren't even connected to the internet precursor that existed at the time. A sixth hypothesis, being examined by Dr. John Jackson and his colleagues in Colorado, is that carbon monoxide in the atmosphere contaminated the shroud, increased the C14 amount, and thus skewed the date. But according to Ramsey of Oxford, there are also a number of reasons to think that carbon monoxide contamination is not likely to have had a significant effect. So far, experimental linen samples have been subjected to normal conditions, but with very high concentrations of carbon monoxide. These initial tests show no significant reaction, even though the sensitivity of the measurements is sufficient to detect contamination that would offset the age by less than a single year. This is to be expected and essentially confirms why this sort of contamination has not been considered a serious issue before. The last hypothesis can be grouped under variations of some sort of neutron flux or radiation given off at the time of what we call the resurrection. Most prominent in this category are Mark Antonacci, author of 2 books on the Shroud, and nuclear engineer Bob Rucker, both of whom are with us in this room today, who believes that radiation from inside the body, and this is a quote from Bob, so radiation caused the image, perhaps either by protons or ultraviolet based on experiments. That was number 1. Number 2, it thrust the blood off the body, heated it, turning it into a liquid, and thrust it against and into the fibers of the shroud. And 3, it caused the shift in the C14 date from 30 to 1260 AD and the slope in the C14 dates. And if you go to shroudstory.com and put in Bob's name, there's a nice piece called A Burst of Radiation Did 3 Things, and it'll go into a lot more detail than just that quote I gave. That's the quote I just read from Bob. I think I'm a little bit behind on that. Mark, in a presentation at a Shroud conference in Pasco, Washington, 2 years ago, stated, "The historically consistent hypothesis is a cloth collapse model involving particle radiation consisting primarily of neutrons and protons, but also involving alpha particles, deuterium, electrons, and perhaps gamma rays, and possibly other electromagnetic radiation, including UV radiation." Adler commented in one of his last papers regarding hypotheses in which radiation is touted as being the cause. He said, "We do not have to invoke any unexplainable sources of particle radiation to explain the date. By reverse reasoning, we therefore can reject all such miracle particle radiation mechanisms from consideration in image formation processes." we have obtained a clean separation between matters of faith and science. Okay, so we'll go to a summary, and let's start with some concluding questions. Is it possible that visible evidence for the reweaving was eradicated with the sample excision? I tend to doubt it because it's likely that the reweave area would have been larger than the small sample that was taken for the dating. The TS had been attached to a backing cloth. Could some of the backing cloth fibers inadvertently been left in the C14 sample, including the portion that Rogers had been given? It is possible that a microfiber or two could have made its way into the C14 sample area, but the cleansing process would have eliminated those. If the invisible reweave is not the answer for why the C14 dating was off, how does one explain all the existing data that point in that direction? Given all the evidence there is for the invisible reweave, I think it's possible that its overall lack of acceptance can possibly be attributed to the mindset exemplified in the humorous saying, "That works very well in practice, but how does it work in theory?" There is a psychological factor known as confirmation bias, which is the tendency to look for, interpret, favor, and call to mind information in a way that confirms one's pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses. There is also its cousin, cognitive dissonance, which is defined as the mental discomfort experienced by a person who simultaneously holds two or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values. This discomfort is triggered by a situation in which a person's belief clashes with new evidence perceived by that person. That basically means that once a person settles on a position, he or she finds it hard to move away from that position, even when new evidence contradicts their stance. And scientists are not immune from this. There's a geographer named Jeffrey Lee, and I stole this quote from one of Gary's books. Jeffrey Lee said, "It is often assumed that science is objective and that evidence from the real world that determines if the theory is correct and the prejudices of the scientists do not affect the results presented. However, scientists are people and they have their biases like everyone else, which adds a subjective element to science. Many scientists who trust the theory for many years are unlikely to discard the theory even if there is strong evidence against it." Okay, this is one of a few slides I'm showing that shows the bibliography of Ray Rogers' production, his publications. And remember that Rogers, who had accepted the 1988 dating, did change his beliefs about the plausibility of a repair being the cause of the skewing of the date. Now, who is more credible? An acclaimed scientist who examined the shroud directly and studied samples intensely under the microscope, or people like individuals wearing white lab coats on their television appearances who have not examined the cloth or samples directly, who work for groups dedicating to proving that there's nothing in the world that can't be explained by science, including the shroud? I bet you can't guess who I'm thinking of there. And then here's a couple more slides of Rogers' publications, just to show you how prolific he was. And I'm just blown away by the number of, am I running over? Okay, I got 3 more minutes. I was going to say Ray Rogers sent tons of emails to tons of people, even when he was sick with cancer. Amazing output of that man. Okay. And there's some of his Shroud. And his resume can be found on Barry's site. Okay. Given all the evidence that has been presented, I maintain that the C14 sample area, having been rewoven, is possibly, and likely probably, the most plausible explanation of why the C14 dating resulted in a medieval date. It also fulfills Occam's razor, which is the problem-solving principle that the simplest solution tends to be the correct one. I agree with the morning speaker on that. Ray Rogers, who wasn't even aware of all the data I collected, was convinced pre-2005 by the chemical evidence alone that repairs had been made to the Shroud. He did not readily use the word prove when talking about the Shroud, but he did use it in his Thermochimica Acta paper. It is the only hypothesis or theory for which there are several papers in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. There is a law dictum that states, against the fact there is no argument. Rogers posed before his death in 2005 a question to the Shroud Science Group, to whom he patiently communicated with for several years, and presented the data he found. And he said, how much evidence is needed? I know we live in a world where if you don't like the facts as they are, you can just make them up. I have presented many objective and independent facts from multiple credible sources with unassailable pedigrees, including from the previous owner of the Shroud, King Umberto, a scientific advisor to the Cardinal of Turin, the scientist who excised the C14 sample, STURP scientists that studied the Shroud and its samples firsthand, confirmatory analysis from other top-notch scientists, including from Los Alamos National Laboratories, multiple archaeologists, multiple textile experts, and they all point in one direction. The evidence clearly indicates numerous various repairs having been done in the C14 sample area of the Shroud in its long history. Many of my references you will be able to find directly online when this presentation is published. Perhaps in 2019, possessing much additional compelling data gathered since Rogers' time, we should consider asking whether Rogers' question, how much evidence is needed, into the statement, against the facts, there are no arguments. Thank you.